The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $355 on a warm, clear September morning in 2007 at the Texaco Port Arthur Refinery Surplus Auction on Procter Street in Port Arthur, Texas, and the heavy-set man in the starched, short-sleeved khaki Refinery Foreman shirt with the small embroidered Texaco PA Refinery patch over the left chest pocket, standing at the side of the cinder block auction shed, let out a thin, clipped laugh through his teeth that turned the heads of every Sabine Pass refinery-zone truck mechanic standing along the chain link. Cleburne Tarrant was 54, 5'11", and broad through the chest, his thinning steel-gray hair combed straight back from a sunburned high forehead under a stiff white plastic refinery hard hat, with Texaco PA Refinery / Shift Foreman stenciled across the front, a clean-shaven, heavy jaw, sharp pale blue eyes set deep above a wind-burned Sabine Pass refinery tan. He wore a starched, short-sleeved khaki Refinery Foreman shirt, buttoned to the throat, over a clean white cotton undershirt, the small embroidered Texaco PA Refinery patch over the left chest pocket, and a small embroidered red and white name patch reading Tarrant over the right. Dark navy, heavy duck refinery trousers belted with a thick black leather belt and a heavy polished chrome buckle stamped with the Texaco star. Polished black steel-toed refinery boots, a small enameled Texaco Red Star lapel pin clipped to the shirt placket, a brass refinery supervisor whistle on a thin black lanyard at his neck, a clipboard with a stack of refinery surplus tags sat tucked under his left arm, and a heavy gold class ring sat on his right ring finger. He had been shift foreman at the Texaco Port Arthur refinery for 19 years, and the surplus auction had been called to clear forfeited refinery-zone contractor iron. The refinery had pulled off its independent fire line and recovery contracts after a 1991 lien default. The 1958 Autocar DC-100 wrecker at the back of the auction list had been on Texaco's contractor default ledger since 1991, and Cleburne had told the auctioneer privately he would have paid the auctioneer a $100 handshake to make the truck disappear before the auction even opened. The 24-year-old refinery-zone truck mechanic at the back of the bidder's line in the deeply faded indigo canvas refinery shop coat had just outbid the refinery for $355 against Cleburne's casual $50 opening shot, and Cleburne was making sure the Sabine Pass refinery hands understood the joke. Wyatt Boudreaux folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his refinery shop coat and walked through the warm gravel to the truck. The Autocar DC-100 was 23 feet of long-nose conventional cab heavy-duty wrecker with the late 1950s Autocar slanted twin headlight grille and the chrome Autocar script badge across the front of the long hood. The cab painted a faded refinery safety yellow, oxidized to chalky bone along the body panels and dusty pale gray along the upper edges of the doors and roof. The chrome Autocar script badge tarnished, both round chrome side cab mirrors snapped off at the brackets, the original Holmes 850 wrecker, boom with a twin drum winch mounted on the rear deck, listing 2 degrees right with a frayed cable. The wooden cargo deck planks rotted, 3 of the 6 tires flat, and the word junk spray-painted in flaking refinery red block letters across the driver's door. Wyatt had grown up on a small shrimp trawler dock 7 miles south of the truck's last parking spot in Sabine Pass. His grandfather, Eustache Boudreaux, was waiting at the trailer. Eustache was 78, a retired Kansas City Southern Sabine subdivision rail yard mechanic who had worked the KCS Beaumont and Port Arthur yards for 42 years, between 1949 and 1991, 6 foot, lean and erect, with broad bony shoulders, snow-white hair, clipped close under a faded black and white striped KCS engineer's cap, a thick white mustache, deep, watery, pale blue eyes, set in a Sabine Pass, sun and salt-weathered face, large knotted hands. A short-stem briar pipe sat unlit between his teeth. He wore a faded indigo canvas refinery shop coat unbuttoned over a faded denim work shirt, buttoned to the throat. Faded dark navy heavy duck trousers held up with thick brown leather suspenders, scuffed black steel-toed refinery boots, and a plain dark brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle stamped with a small Kansas City Southern shield. Eustache set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted bumper of the DC-100 and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Otis Thibodeaux's old DC-100. Otis Thibodeaux had run Thibodeaux refinery-zone recovery out of a small cinder-block shop on Texas Highway 87 outside Sabine Pass from 1976 until the catalytic-cracker scaffold collapse, pulling overturned refinery fireline trucks out of the catalytic-cracker units and stuck Texaco refinery-zone service trucks off the back loading docks of the Port Arthur tank farm spurs. He had built the Holmes 850 wrecker boom himself onto the DC-100's rear deck in 1979 with the help of 2 welders from the KCS Port Arthur yard on a long Labor Day weekend. He had married a Sabine Pass girl named Marielle Naquin in 1982, and they had a daughter, Celeste, born in 1986. Otis had died in September of 1990. He had been working a refinery fireline truck recovery at a Texaco Texas City catalytic-cracker unit in a heavy late summer storm when a section of cracker scaffold above the recovery site let go and dropped a steel I-beam across the cab of his own DC-100. He had died at the scene. He was 44. Celeste was 4. The DC-100 had been recovered out of the cracker scaffold site by another wrecker out of Beaumont and parked behind the Thibodeaux refinery zone shop on Texas Highway 87. Marielle had paid the Jefferson County property tax on the shop and the truck for 1 year until the refinery's 1991 lien default, and Texaco had taken the property and the inventory through Cleburne Terrence contractor default desk. The DC-100 had sat in the back of Texaco's surplus shed off Procter Street for 16 more years until the surplus auction. Wyatt had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a KCS retiree that Otis Thibodeaux's truck was finally being sold. They winched the DC-100 onto Wyatt's borrowed flatbed trailer. Cleburne Terrence stood at the side of the auction tent in his starched khaki Refinery Foreman shirt and watched the brass refinery supervisor whistle catching the late summer Gulf sun, and as Wyatt pulled out, he called across the gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, Texaco would arrange disposal for $100 cash. Wyatt did not answer. Eustache climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 11 miles north up Texas Highway 87 to Eustache's galvanized steel pole barn shop outside Bridge City, the Holmes 850 boom, pointing at the warm, gray September Texas sky like a bent finger. The restoration would take 18 years. Nobody knew that on the drive north. Wyatt worked his day job at a heavy truck shop in Port Arthur during the week and drove 15 minutes north on Texas Highway 87 to Eustache's pole barn every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the cab and the steel battery tray frame under the cab because Eustache insisted. The Autocar DC-100 cab had taken the brunt of the I-beam strike, and the steel battery tray frame mounted under the cab had been bent inward by the impact. They removed the original dash for inspection and set it on the bench. They pulled the heavy steel battery tray frame out from under the cab and set it on sawhorses in the corner of the pole barn. They pulled the Cummins NHC 250 cubic inch inline-six diesel engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true. The head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed Spicer manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long Texas Gulf winter went into the engine and into stories about Otis Thibodeaux. Eustache told Wyatt about the night in 1980 when Otis pulled a stuck Texaco refinery-zone fireline truck out of a Sabine Pass catalytic-cracker bay at 38 degrees and refused payment, except for a bushel of fresh Sabine Pass white shrimp from his sister-in-law's trawler. He told stories about Mariel Thibodeaux's seafood gumbo. The second year, they sandblasted the I-beam rusted frame down to clean steel. By the 5th year, the cab came off. In the 7th year, Eustache slowed. He had a small heart attack in March and was at Christus St. Mary Hospital in Port Arthur for 10 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hands still worked. He told Wyatt the truck would wait. By the 9th year, the DC-100 was a roller. In the 11th year, Wyatt's daughter was born, and the work paused for a month. By the 14th year, Eustache sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding wooden chair beside the pole barn's window air conditioner. The faded black and white striped KCS engineer's cap pulled low, the short-stem briar pipe between his teeth, pointing at what to do next. Through all those years, Cleburne Tarrant drove past the foot of Eustache's gravel drive in his marooned Lincoln Town car with the Texaco Red Star decal on the windshield. The Lincoln always slowed but never quite turned in. By the 15th year, the DC-100 was painted. They had wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy refinery safety yellow that matched a faded snapshot Eustache had of the truck from 1981, and they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking refinery red junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Wyatt did not know why. He just left it. By the 17th year, the Holmes 850 boom was rebuilt with a fresh aircraft-grade twin-drum cable. By the 18th year, the DC-100 was nearly whole. They had not yet bolted the heavy steel battery tray frame back under the cab for the new battery bank. The battery tray frame was the last thing on the list because Eustache always said you start with what makes the truck move and you finish with what gives her cranking power on a Texas City fireline call. On a warm, clear morning of September the 20th of the 18th year, Wyatt pulled into Eustache's pole barn with a set of fresh battery hold-down brackets and a half-inch socket. He was 42. The brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across his right forearm from a snapped Autocar U-bolt in 2014 was a faint line, and his hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Eustache was 96. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the pole barn's window air conditioner with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees, the faded black and white striped KCS engineer's cap pulled low, the short-stem briar pipe between his teeth. Wyatt walked to the battery tray frame on its sawhorses and started to bolt the new battery hold-down brackets onto the upper rail of the frame. He stopped. There was a small hand-welded steel pocket arc-welded to the inside of the battery tray frame on the underside of the upper rail behind where the battery bank had sat, the weld bead hand-applied. Wyatt set down the socket. He took a thin, cold chisel and a small ball-peen hammer and gently cracked the weld around the small pocket. The pocket came free in his hand. He carried the pocket to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and slit the soldered seam with a heated putty knife and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas bound with brown twine, were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 90 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper totaling $1,800. There was a small brass deep water dock badge with a small enameled shrimp trawler and pelican emblem in the center, and the engraved words Sabine Pass Deep Water Dock Masters Association / charter member / 1934 around the brass face above 3 small initials. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 3 in a faded yellow Cajun cotton sundress, standing on the wooden plank dock at Sabine Pass, holding a small white shrimp out toward the camera, the date July 1989 written on the back in pencil. And there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded but legible. Wyatt unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated September the 17th of 1990. It read, "To my Celeste. The cash is for whatever a young woman needs at 18 when Sabine Pass cannot hold her. The badge is your grandfather Augustine's. He was a 1934 charter member of the Sabine Pass Deepwater Dock Masters Association, and he wore it on his dock master's vest every shrimp season until he gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1964. The photograph is of you the morning your grandfather walked you down to the Sabine Pass deep water dock to see the first white shrimp of the summer brought in. I am welding this pocket inside the battery tray frame because the catalytic-cracker scaffold above the Texas City units has been creaking in storm wind for 3 Septembers running, and I do not want anything lost. If the scaffold above the recovery site lets go on the next fire line call, the truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Otis Thibodeaux, Sabine Pass, Texas, September 17th, 1990. Wyatt sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Eustache held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. He said quietly, "Otis wrote this 3 days before the cracker scaffold let go above the recovery site at Texas City." The girl never knew. They drove south to Sabine Pass the next Saturday. Eustache had called a KCS retiree whose niece kept the Sabine Pass shrimp trawler dispatch office, and the niece had given them a current address for Celeste Thibodeaux Naquin on a small storefront shrimp trawler dispatch office on Shell Beach Drive in Sabine Pass. They drove south on Texas Highway 87 under a warm, clear September Gulf morning, past long, flat salt marsh and shrimp trawler dock pilings, and parked in front of a small clapboard storefront with a hand-painted wooden sign above the door reading Thibodeaux Naquin Shrimp Trawler Dispatch. The woman who came out of the storefront in a faded canvas dispatch apron was 39. She had Otis Thibodeaux's broad shoulders and her father's deep, pale blue eyes. She wore a faded khaki canvas dispatch apron over a faded denim work shirt, faded dark navy heavy duck trousers, scuffed black steel-toed refinery boots, a small silver shrimp trawler and pelican pendant at her throat, a thin gold wedding band on her left ring finger. Eustache spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his DC-100 in my pole barn in 1985. My grandson here bought the autocar at the Texaco Port Arthur refinery surplus auction over on Procter Street 18 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something welded inside her battery tray frame that belongs to you." Celeste's face changed. She brought them into a small dispatch office kitchen, and they sat at a round cypress farm office table, and Wyatt set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the brass badge, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Celeste picked up the brass Deepwater Dock badge. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving around the brass face. She said her grandfather, Augustin, had been a 1934 charter member of the Sabine Pass Deepwater Dockmasters Association, that the family had been told the badge had been sold to a Galveston antique dealer in 1972 after Augustin died, and that she had been looking through Gulf Coast estate sales for 25 years for that badge. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her north to Eustache's pole barn the next morning. Celeste walked slowly around the DC-100 3 times in the open bay. She ran her hand along the chrome Autocar script badge on the front of the long hood and the late 1950s slanted twin headlight grille. She stood at the driver's door, where the flaking refinery red junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Wyatt and asked the price. Wyatt looked at his grandfather. Eustache laid both hands on his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone, and then we are going to drive her down Texas Highway 87 to the empty cinder block lot where Thibodeaux refinery-zone recovery stood until September of 1990. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1976. The boy paid $355 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you. They finished the DC-100 through that winter. Celeste drove up from her dispatch storefront every other Sunday. On the morning of April the 19th of the 19th year, they rolled the DC-100 out of Eustache's pole barn under a clear blue Texas Gulf sky and drove her in convoy south on Texas Highway 87 to the empty cinder block lot where Thibodeaux refinery-zone recovery had stood until September of 1990. Wyatt handed Celeste a small can of deep refinery safety yellow paint and a 1-inch brush. Celeste climbed up on the running board and painted out the flaking refinery red junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, Thibodeaux, Refinery-Zone Recovery, established 1976, old enough to drive her without breaking her. She stepped down. A polished maroon Lincoln Town car went by on Texas Highway 87. Cleburne Tarrant was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the DC-100, at the empty cinder-block lot with the safety yellow door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The DC-100 sits on Texas Highway 87 outside Sabine Pass today, and the sign on the door reads, Thibodeaux, Refinery-Zone Recovery, established 1976. Celeste runs the shrimp trawler dispatch in Sabine Pass. The $1,800 sits in a small lockbox at her dispatch storefront. The 1934 Sabine Pass Deepwater Dockmaster's charter badge sits beside it. The 1989 Sabine Pass Deep Water Dock photograph is framed above her kitchen table. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her closet. She reads it once a year, on the 17th of September. If you ever see an old Autocar DC-100 parked along Texas Highway 87 outside Sabine Pass with the words Thibodeaux Refinery-Zone Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down, roll the window down, and listen. There is a story in that truck that a refinery shift foreman in a starched khaki shirt would have arranged disposal for $100 cash. And the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.